The light over Harbor Point came in low and gold that October afternoon, the kind of light that made the Atlantic look gentler than it ever actually was, sliding across the marble floor of the Ashworth Cove resort lobby like something poured rather than shone. Aveline Sutherland had worked that lobby for 6 years, and she knew its moods the way a sailor knows weather. She knew which corner caught the worst afternoon glare, which guest would tip generously, and which would complain about a stain that wasn't there. And she knew without needing to check her watch that it was 20 minutes past 3 because the light always told her so. She was carrying a tray of sparkling water toward the corner tables when she heard it. Not a crash exactly, more a held breath suddenly released into chaos. The skid of small sneakers across polished stone, the soft grunt of an adult absorbing unexpected weight, and then the bright scattering disaster of a tray going sideways near the entrance, icing glass spreading in a fan across the floor. She turned. Owen stood in the middle of it, chest heaving, a crumpled paper airplane somewhere behind him, all knees and elbows, in the kind of forward momentum that had never once consulted caution. He was staring up at the man he had run into. For half a second, the whole lobby went still. The man was tall in a way that reorganized a room rather than simply occupying it. Dark suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone with the precision of someone who had decided to look less composed than he was. Late 30s, a face that had once been simply handsome and was now something more complicated, all sharpened angles and eyes that gave away nothing. He had caught Owen by both shoulders before the boy hit the floor, and now he stood completely strangely still. Aveline was already moving. She crossed the lobby in a dozen steps, set the tray on the nearest surface, and reached them with her hand finding Owen's shoulder, pulling him back half a step. "I am so sorry," she said, looking up at the stranger. "He knows better than to run in here. Are you all right?" The man did not answer right away. That was the first thing that registered as strange. People in this lobby always had a script, ready, mild irritation dressed up as graciousness, or real irritation dressed up as something more controlled. This man had no script at all. He was looking at Owen the way a person looks at something they cannot immediately explain as something that does not fit any category they already own. His hands had released the boy's shoulders, but he had not stepped back. A muscle worked once beneath his jaw. "I am fine," he said. His voice came out lower than she expected, flat in the way of a man who had spent years training his voice to give nothing away. He looked at Owen for 2 more seconds, then dragged his gaze up to her. "No damage done. Let me have someone replace what's spilled." "It is fine," she said. Not harsh, final. He picked up the leather case that had fallen with him, and he walked toward the check-in desk, and Aveline watched him go with the exhaustion of a woman who had spent 6 years apologizing for other people's inconvenience and was very tired of it. She turned back to Owen. "Go to the break room," she said quietly. "Sit down. Touch nothing. I will be there in 20 minutes. "Mom, I did not mean to. I know you did not mean to. Go." He went shoulders sloped, in the way he had when he knew he had crossed a line he could not yet name. She picked up the tray and went back to work, and she told herself the moment had already ended. His name was Bennett Ashworth. She learned it the way she learned most things, through proximity and necessity. The assistant manager circulated a brief before the private retreat that began the next morning, a single sheet of names and room numbers and preferences, because Ashworth Cove prided itself on what it called anticipatory service, which meant knowing enough about wealthy guests to make them feel seen without making them feel watched. Bennett Ashworth Venture Capital, based in Boston. No dietary restrictions, no +1. Suite 14 facing the water. That was all. She folded the brief and slid it into her apron pocket and tried not to think about the way he had looked at Owen. The retreat ran 5 days. She saw him at breakfast the second morning, alone at a corner table with black coffee and a laptop. He was not really reading, scrolling with the focused blankness of a man performing concentration. She saw him in the lobby that afternoon, back to the room, one hand flat against the glass overlooking the cove, his voice low and cold into the phone. "That is not what the projection showed, and you know it." Someone on the other end was being taken apart with great efficiency. She saw him near the service stairs the third evening, and that time he looked up, and their eyes held half a second too long before she made herself walk on. On the fourth morning, Owen was there again. Saturdays were complicated. School was closed, and her usual sitter had canceled with 4 hours' notice. So she had arranged for him to sit in the small courtyard garden under the loose supervision of the groundskeeper, a patient older man named Russ, who did not mind children as long as they stayed clear of the flower beds. Owen had stayed clear of the flower beds. He had, however, found his way to a stone bench near the garden's eastern gate, which happened to border the walkway Bennett used for his morning calls. Russ came to find her first. "They are just talking," Russ said, which was how she knew she would find something she did not want to find. She rounded the hedge and stopped. Owen sat on the bench with his elbows on his knees in the posture he used when explaining something he found genuinely fascinating. Bennett sat 3 feet away on the low garden wall, his phone nowhere in sight, his jacket draped over his arm, looking at Owen with an expression she could not immediately place. Not predatory, not even particularly warm, just intent. The way a person looks when listening to something that does not yet make sense and waiting for the piece that will. "And the wingspan has to be exactly right," Owen was saying, demonstrating with his hands. "Otherwise, it just nosedives. Most people make the fold too steep." Owen Aveline's voice came out sharper than she intended. Both of them turned. Owen registered immediately that he was in some kind of trouble, though he could not have said why. Bennett stood and something shifted behind his eyes, the intent expression closing back into the neutral blankness she had seen at the check-in desk. "He was not bothering me," Bennett said. "He is supposed to be in the garden." "This is the garden, the other part of the garden." Owen slid off the bench and came to stand beside her. She set her hand on his shoulder, and she watched Bennett look at that, her hand on her son's shoulder, the two of them standing together, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not read. "He is yours," Bennett said. It was not a question. "He is," she said, keeping her voice level. "Come on, Owen." She walked her son back through the hedge and handed him to Russ and returned to her station. And she told herself the encounter had meant nothing, and she almost believed it. He found her the fourth afternoon in the quiet window between lunch and dinner prep when she was taking inventory near the service bar and heard footsteps that did not belong to staff. Unhurried, the cadence of someone with nowhere else to be and no interest in pretending otherwise. "Miss Sutherland." She turned. He stood just inside the service entrance, somewhere guests were never supposed to be, and he looked oddly out of place there among the supply shelves and stacked linen carts too composed for the space. His hands were in his pockets, a habit she had already noticed he used when trying to seem less formidable. It did not work. "This area is for staff," she said. "I know. I asked where I might find you." She set down her clipboard. "What do you need, Mr. Ashworth?" "I can get someone from the concierge desk." "I do not need the concierge." He looked at her steadily. "I need to ask you something, and I would like you to hear me out before you shut it down. That is an interesting way to begin a conversation. I have been told I am not good at small talk." He did not look apologetic about it. "Your son, how old is he?" The air in the room seemed to drop 3 degrees. She felt it at the back of her neck, the prickling awareness of standing at the edge of something. "I do not discuss my son with guests," she said. "I am not asking as a guest. I am asking because he stopped, pressed his mouth together, tried again. Because he looks exactly like photographs I have of myself at that age." The sentence landed quietly, almost gently. And it was, she realized, the most dangerous thing anyone had said to her in 8 years because it carried no accusation, no aggression, none of the shapes she had spent years bracing herself against. It was simply a man standing in a service corridor, telling her something that frightened him. She did not let it matter. "Lots of children look like lots of people," she said. "It is a coincidence. Maybe. Or maybe not. I would like to know which." "Mr. Ashworth." "Bennett." "Mr. Ashworth." She picked the clipboard back up. "I think you should return to your retreat." He studied her a moment longer, the muscle below his jaw working again. "I am not trying to make a problem," he said. "That is not what this is." "What is it then?" "I do not know yet." He said it with the flat certainty of someone telling the truth and finding the truth inconvenient. "But I think you do." He left. She stood very still for a long time, her clipboard against her chest, breathing the way she had taught herself to breathe when the ground shifted without warning. She had 8 years of practice at that skill. She did not let herself think about the storm, not that night and not for the rest of the shift, but she sat in her car in the employee lot afterward and thought about nothing else. 9 years earlier, before the resort expansion, when the South Docks were still open to the public, and the sailing club ran charity regattas that local businesses sponsored for goodwill and tax deductions, A storm had come up fast off the Atlantic, faster than anyone predicted. The organizers had made the call to shelter the volunteers overnight in the harbor master's office and the adjoining boathouse while the weather passed. 14 people sleeping bags on hardwood floors, rain hammering the tin roof, smell of rope and salt water, and a man she had talked to for 6 hours straight. A man she had met that morning and somehow felt she had known forever. He had made her laugh in a way that felt like recognition rather than performance. He had looked at her when she spoke as though what she said was the most interesting thing he had heard in years. He told her his name was Bennett. He told her he was in town for a friend's funeral, that he had volunteered for the regatta because he needed something to do with his hands. He had not said much about his family, and she had not pushed, because the night had felt fragile in the way nights feel fragile when you already know they are temporary, and you do not want to break something by asking for more than it is offering. She had known the moment she read the staff brief. She had known it and told herself she was wrong. Told herself it was a common enough name. Told herself the man in the expensive suit with the carved stone composure could not possibly be the same man who had sat across from her on a boathouse floor in a storm, and told her he had never once felt like he belonged anywhere. But he was. She drove home through the coastal dark that night and stood in the doorway of Owen's room, watching him sleep the way she did most nights, a mixture of love and fear and exhaustion that made up the whole architecture of her life. He slept with one arm thrown over his head, which was something she had always done, and his jaw, even relaxed in sleep, had that same set to it, that same angle she had been studying all day on a man who claimed not to know he had a son. She sat down on the hallway floor with her back against the wall and thought about 9 years of silence, about the letter she had written that had never been answered, and the second letter written 6 months later that had also gone unanswered, and the decision she had made after that. The decision that this was her life now, hers and her son's, and she would build something real out of it without waiting for a man who had clearly decided she was not worth coming back for. She had built something. It was not what she had dreamed, but it was real, and it was hers, and Owen was extraordinary. She did not need Bennett Ashworth walking into her resort and looking at her son like a miracle he had lost the receipt for. She told herself before sleep finally took her that tomorrow she would be professional and distant, that he would check out on Friday, and that would be the end of it. She was almost certain she was lying to herself. The fifth morning he was waiting at the staff entrance before her shift, not pacing, not checking his phone, simply standing there with a cup of coffee as though he had nowhere more important to be than a parking lot at 6:50 in the morning. The stillness of it, the sheer self-possessed confidence, made something twist in her chest that was equal parts anger and something she did not want to name. "You cannot be back here," she said. "I checked out this morning." He held up a key card between two fingers. "I am not a guest anymore. Technically, I am just a person standing in a parking lot." "What do you want, Bennett?" She used his first name without meaning to. She watched him register it, a small tightening around his eyes, the closest thing to an expression cracking through the composure. "I want to know if he is my son," he said. No preamble. The words hit her like cold water, not because they surprised her, but because hearing them aloud made something inside her that had been braced for years suddenly buckle. "He is my son," she said. "I know he is yours. That is not what I asked." The gulls circled somewhere overhead. The smell of low tide hung in the air. She stared at him and thought about all the ways this conversation could go, all the versions she had run through her head over the past 8 years, and none of them felt adequate for the actual flat gray light of standing in front of him. "You never called," she said. Her voice was steady and she was proud of that. "I wrote to you twice. You never responded." Something happened to his face. What letters he said and the sharp immediate confusion in it, not defensive, not guilty, just genuinely uncomprehending, stopped her cold. "What do you mean, what letters?" "I mean, I never received any letters." He went very still. "I left for London 6 days after the storm. My father had died. I found out the next morning. I had to leave. I did not have your number, and I did not know your last name. I knew the sailing club, but you were not registered as a volunteer. You had signed in under the business name, and I could not find you. I spent 2 years trying. Where did you send the letters?" "The address you gave me," she said. "The Ashworth address. The one you wrote on a napkin and told me to send anything, anything at all." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. It was the longest 4 seconds of her life. That address, Bennett said quietly, was managed by my guardian, my father's estate manager. He handled all correspondence while I was overseas. He looked at her, and something behind his eyes was doing something she could not name. Not quite grief, not quite rage, something colder and more dangerous than either. His name is Gareth Pruitt, Bennett said. He managed everything. She felt the ground shift again, the seismic sensation she had grown so good at absorbing. He never forwarded them, she said. It was not a question. No, Bennett said. I do not think he did. They stood there in the flat morning air of a coastal parking lot, 9 years of absence, reorganizing itself into something that was not abandonment at all, but something worse, something deliberate. There is a coffee place on Anchor Street, she said finally. I have 40 minutes before my shift. He nodded once, that was all. Dune smelled of roasted beans and the quiet of places that opened early for fishermen and shift workers. No music, no ambient noise, just the hiss of an espresso machine and two other customers minding their own business. They sat across from each other at a corner table, and for a moment neither spoke. She looked at his hands wrapped around the cup and thought how strange it was to sit across from a man whose absence had shaped 9 years of her life. Tell me about the letters, he said. Tell me about London first. He set his cup down. My father had a stroke while I was at the regatta. The news did not reach me until the next morning. I had to leave within the hour. I did not have time. He exhaled. That is not an excuse. I should have found a way to reach you. I did not have your number, did not have your last name. I knew the name of your employer from something you had said, but I could not remember which one. He stopped again. I was managing an estate, a board transition, a legal restructuring. All of it while grieving a man I had not fully figured out how to love yet. By the time I surfaced enough to think clearly, 6 months had passed, and I did not know where to start. Aveline listened, kept her face neutral. Gareth Pruitt, she said. How long has he managed your affairs? Since I was 19. He was my father's executive assistant. After the stroke, he stayed on to oversee the trust. He had power of attorney during my first year in London. Bennett's jaw tightened. He handled all inbound correspondence at the estate, everything physical. I sent 2 letters, she said. The first was 3 months after the storm. I told you I was pregnant. I asked you to call me if you wanted to be involved and told you I would understand if you did not. I included my number. She kept her voice even. The second was 6 months after Owen was born. I included a photograph. Bennett said nothing. His hands around the cup were very still. I waited another 3 months, she said. Then I stopped waiting. I am not done, he said quietly. She met his eyes. I decided you had made your choice, and I made mine, and I built a life for my son that he does not need dismantled because you have suddenly decided to show up in a parking lot 9 years late. I am not trying to dismantle anything. Then what are you trying to do? I am trying to understand what was taken from me. His voice did not rise, but the flatness deepened, gained weight. If those letters were intercepted, if Gareth deliberately kept this from me, then someone decided I did not get to know I had a son. Someone made that choice for me. And I would like, he said each word placed carefully, to know who did that and why, and what else they have been doing with my life while I was not looking. The espresso machine hissed. One of the other customers scraped his chair back and left. I want a DNA test, she said. I will arrange it discreetly, and while we wait for the results, you will not contact Owen. You will not contact my employer, and you will not discuss this with anyone. Agreed. And if the results say what we both already know they say, she held his gaze. Then we talk again about what comes next, about what is appropriate, about what Owen is ready for, not about what you are ready for, about what he is. He looked at her for a moment with something she might in another context have called respect. Agreed, he said again. The results took 8 days. 8 days during which Aveline worked her shifts and picked Owen up from school and helped him with a science project on tide patterns and listened to him explain the aerodynamic difference between a dart fold and what he called a Nakamura lock in paper airplane construction, and tried very hard not to think about the test kit sitting in the back of her closet, or the man somewhere in the city waiting, or the way his eyes had looked when she told him about Owen's photograph. She thought about all of it constantly. The result came through on a Thursday morning to an email address she had created specifically for this purpose. She opened it in her car in the resort parking lot 20 minutes before her shift. Probability of paternity, 99.998%. She sat with that number for a while. She had known. She had known since the lobby. She had known with some wordless certainty the moment she turned and saw Bennett holding her son by the shoulders, looking at him like the ground had opened up. But knowing and confirmation were different things. Confirmation had weight. Confirmation meant the next step was no longer theoretical. She did not text him. She drove to a side street near his hotel where he had told her he would be waiting and found him standing beside his car with the stillness of a man who had spent 8 days not letting himself hope and was now afraid the hope had been correct. Confirm, she said. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he nodded once slowly and something in his face simply broke open briefly before he gathered it back. I need to find Gareth's records, he said. What good does that do? It tells me if this was deliberate or just negligence. It tells me if there is anything else. She studied him. You think there is more. I think a man who keeps everything does not stop at 2 letters. She did not ask what he meant by that yet. She had a shift starting in 12 minutes, in a son who needed picking up from school in 6 hours, and a life that did not pause for revelations no matter how large. I have to go, she said. I know, he paused. Thank you for telling me. She got into her car and drove to work, and for the first time in 8 years, the ordinary machinery of her day, the trays and the tables and the polite, false warmth required of her, felt like something happening at a great distance, while the real events of her life unfolded somewhere just out of frame. 3 days later, she met Gareth Pruitt, which was not something she had planned or agreed to. She came out of the resort's side exit at the end of her afternoon shift, and he was standing beside her car. 60, perhaps. 65, the heavy set of decades of expensive dinners, silver hair parted with surgical precision, a suit that cost more than her monthly rent. He held his hands loosely in front of him, a posture meant to read as relaxed and reading instead as rehearsed. Her whole body went cold. Miss Sutherland, he said. His voice was warm and entirely empty. I wonder if we might have a brief conversation. How do you know who I am? Bennett mentioned meeting someone at the resort. I wanted to introduce myself. He smiled, and the smile did not reach anything. I have known Bennett since he was a boy. I consider myself something of a guardian to him even now. He is 40 years old. Yes, the smile stayed exactly where it was. Some people require more looking after than others. Bennett has always had a tendency toward impulsive decisions, particularly where women are concerned. I simply wanted to make sure you understood the nature of things. Mr. Pruitt, she shouldered her bag. I do not know you. You do not know me. Whatever you are about to suggest, I would encourage you to think carefully before you finish that sentence. The smile went away. Underneath it was something she recognized from the hardest moments of her life, the flatness of a person who had never once been told no by someone they had badly underestimated. You are in a complicated position, he said. A resort employee, a single mother. What you are reaching for here, what Bennett thinks he wants in this moment, it is not going to hold. Men like Bennett have these pause episodes of conscience. They pass. What does not pass is the damage they do to people who are not equipped to protect themselves. Are you threatening me? I am advising you. Those are the same thing. He looked at her a long moment, then straightened his jacket. The Ashworth estate, he said, is a significant entity. Its affairs are managed with great care. Introducing destabilizing claims into that environment, particularly claims that are difficult to verify. There is nothing difficult to verify, she said. We have already verified it. The temperature between them seemed to drop 10 degrees. She watched something small and quick move across his face, a flicker of calculation gone almost before she could name it. He had not known. Bennett had not told him. He had come here fishing, and she had just handed him exactly what he was fishing for. She had the sudden, vertiginous sensation of having made a mistake. I see, he said softly. He adjusted his cufflinks. Well, I hope you will be thoughtful about how you proceed. For the boy's sake, if nothing else. He walked away. She watched him go, her hands shaking slightly around the strap of her bag, and she made herself breathe in and out before she reached for her phone. Bennett picked up on the second ring. He knows, she said. Gareth? He came to my car. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 1 second. Get Owen, Bennett said. His voice had gone completely flat. Do not go home first. Pick him up from school right now and take him somewhere that is not your apartment, Bennett. Listen to me, Nabit. I know how Gareth operates. He does not warn people unless he has already decided on a next step. The warning is just him being courteous to himself. His voice was steady, but underneath it she heard something she had not heard from him before, something urgent and barely controlled. Please, get Owen. I will explain everything, but I need you to move first. She was already walking toward her car. Where do I take him? There is a woman named Pauline Hartley, a former colleague of mine. She lives in Harbor Point. I will text you the address. She does not know Gareth. She does not appear in any of my professional records. She is safe. He paused. Tell her I sent you. She will understand. What are you doing? Going to get the letters, he said. Bennett. But he had already ended the call. She got in her car and pulled out of the lot and drove toward Owen's school with both hands tight on the wheel, her mind moving fast through everything Gareth Pruitt had said and everything he had not, and the way his face had changed when she told him the test was done. She thought about a man who kept everything, who archived instead of destroying, who had spent 9 years sitting on evidence of what he had done, certain it would never matter. Certain the woman who sent those letters would never become relevant enough to threaten him. She thought about how much had shifted in the space of 10 days, and she thought with a clarity that felt almost like calm that this was no longer a story about a lost father and a hidden son. This was something else now. She turned onto Owen Street and saw the school ahead. Children beginning to filter out the front gate, and she scanned the sidewalk until she found him, backpack half open, arguing with some other boy about something, gesturing with both hands the way he did when he was making a point he was very sure of. She pulled to the curb and got out. Mom, Owen frowned at her. You are early. I know, she said, keeping her voice light. Change of plans. Come on. He looked at her face, really looked with the uncanny precision that sometimes made her feel transparent, and something shifted in his expression. Are we okay, he asked. She opened the car door for him. We are going to be, she said. And somewhere across the state, in an upper coastal estate that Bennett had not set foot in for 7 years, the man who had stolen 9 years from all three of them was opening his phone and making a call of his own, and the thing that had been buried so carefully for so long was about to claw its way to the surface, whether Gareth Pruitt wanted it to or not. Pauline Hartley's house sat 3 blocks from the water on the quiet side of Harbor Point, the kind of street where neighbors knew each other's ranges and noticed unfamiliar ones within the hour. Aveline pulled into the drive with Owen asleep against the window, worn out from the strange afternoon, and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel before she made herself get out. Pauline answered before she knocked, as though she had been watching from the front window the entire time. 60 years old, lean with the directness that came from 3 decades teaching constitutional law before retiring to a quieter coastline. She had met Bennett years earlier through a property dispute where she had served as an expert witness, and something about her steadiness had stayed with him ever since. Anyone follow you? Pauline asked. Not that I saw. Come in. Your boy can sleep in the guest room. Aveline carried Owen inside, and the house smelled like books and old coffee, the tidiness of someone who lived alone and had made peace with it. She settled him upstairs, pulled the blanket to his chin, and stood in the doorway a moment, watching the rise and fall of his chest the way she did most nights, except tonight the watching felt different. Tonight it felt like counting something. When she came back down, Pauline had put on a pot of coffee neither of them needed, and sat across the kitchen table with the patience of someone who understood that some conversations could not be rushed and others could not wait. Tell me what is happening, she said. So Aveline told her. The lobby, the garden, the parking lot at 6:50 in the morning, the coffee shop on Anchor Street, the letters that had never arrived. Gareth Pruitt's hands loosely folded in front of him like a man rehearsing relaxation. By the time she finished, the coffee had gone cold in both their cups, and Pauline was looking at her with an expression that had moved from careful neutrality into something sharper. He came to your car alone, Pauline said. No witnesses, no paper trail. That is what worried me. It should worry you more than that. Pauline turned her cup slowly on the table, not drinking from it. Men like that do not threaten people for sport. They threaten people because something has already been decided, and the threat is meant to manage the fallout before it starts. The fact that he came to you and not to Bennett tells you something. What does it tell me? That you are the part of this he thinks he can move. Aveline sat with that for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up off the water, rattling the old storm windows in their frames. And somewhere upstairs, Owen turned over in his sleep with the small, contented sound he made when a dream pleased him. He is wrong, Aveline said finally. I believe you, Pauline said. But believing it and proving it are different appetites entirely. If you are going to do this, you need to think like the people who built whatever they built. Quietly, patiently. Documenting everything as you go the way they have clearly been documenting everything for years. They kept records because records felt like power to them. That habit is going to be the thing that ends them. Aveline looked at her hands on the table at the faint callus along her right palm. From 6 years of carrying trays at the chipped polish, she had not had time to redo in weeks. I am not a lawyer, she said. I am not an investigator. I am a waitress with a son. You are a woman who has been managing other people's carelessness for 6 years without anyone noticing how carefully you were doing it, Pauline said. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, exactly the skill this requires. Bennett called twice that evening, his voice tight with controlled urgency. He told her what he had found at the Ashworth estate office. The locked filing cabinets, the desk key hidden in a ceramic dish by the side door that Gareth had never bothered to move in 20 years, because Gareth never imagined a version of events where Bennett would come looking for something specific. I am driving back now, he said. I have the ledger pages. I want to see them tonight, she said. All of them. There was a pause on the line. Aveline, I am not asking permission, Bennett. This is my life he was archiving in a filing cabinet. I want to see what he wrote about me with my own eyes. Another pause longer this time, and then something in his voice shifted. Not resistance exactly, more the sound of a man recalibrating his understanding of who was actually steering this particular ship. Okay, he said, I will bring everything. He arrived at Pauline's house just after 9, carrying a thin folder and a face that had aged years in the span of an afternoon. Pauline let him in without comment and retreated to the front room with a book she did not appear to be reading, granting them the kitchen and whatever privacy two people could manage, while a child slept upstairs and a quiet war assembled itself around them. Aveline spread the photographed ledger pages across the table and read them twice before she let herself speak. The handwriting was dense, cramped cross referenced in a private shorthand that took real effort to follow. But some things did not need decoding. Dates were dates. Dollar amounts were dollar amounts. And the entries that mentioned her when Gareth had bothered to use her name at all were small and clinical, and somehow worse for their lack of drama. CM correspondence received. Filed. No action. CM follow-up received. Photo enclosed. Filed. Held for future disposition. She read that last phrase 4 times. Held for future disposition, as though she were inventory, as though her son were a line item awaiting a decision someone else had the authority to make. Bennett watched her read it, and he did not say anything, which she appreciated more than she could have told him in that moment, because there was nothing to say that would have made the phrase mean less. He calls this a protocol, Bennett said finally. There is a notation further back, a reference to a standing arrangement for handling unsolicited correspondence regarding personal matters. This was not improvise. This was policy. Aveline turned the page, found the transfer entries Bennett had described on the phone. Irregular intervals, varying amounts always routed through accounts labeled only as external consulting. She was not a financial analyst, but she had spent 6 years reading the small print on resort invoices that wealthy guests never bothered to check, and she recognized the shape of something designed to look ordinary while meaning something else entirely. $2 million, she said, over 8 years. To someone, Bennett said, the ledger does not name who is receiving it, just that it is consistent, predictable, like a salary. A salary for what? That is what I do not know yet. She looked up at him. In the kitchen light, his face had none of the carved stillness she had first seen across a lobby 10 days earlier. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the exhaustion of a man discovering that the architecture of his own life had been built around a hole he never knew was there. I want to go back, she said. Back where? To the estate. I want to see the room myself. I want to see the cabinet where he kept my letters with my own eyes, not through a photograph on a phone screen. Bennett's jaw tightened. That is not a good idea. Why not? Because if Gareth or anyone connected to him is watching that property, and after today, I think we have to assume someone is then going back, doubles the risk for no real gain. I already have what was in the file. You have what he let you find, she said. You went in once quickly looking for specific things. I want to go in and look at everything. The way you read a room when you have spent years learning that the things people do not want you to notice are usually the things worth noticing. He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted from concern into something closer to recognition. You really do think like that, he said, like a person reading a room. I have spent 6 years invisible in rooms full of people who never once wondered what I was paying attention to, she said. It turns out that is useful for something besides carrying trays. They went the next afternoon while Owen stayed with Pauline working on a science project about tide patterns that he had been threatening to expand into a full presentation on ocean currents generally. Bennett drove the coastal highway up through the hills, where old money had built itself stone walls and long driveways, and Aveline watched the landscape change from working harbor to something quieter and more deliberately private. The kind of wealth that did not announce itself so much as simply assume everyone already understood. The house appeared at the end of the gravel drive, the way old houses like that always did. Gray stone and dark windows built more than a century earlier by an Ashworth who had made his fortune in shipping and spent it on permanence. It looked less like a home than an argument for a certain kind of life, the kind that felt correct by definition because it had simply lasted. Bennett's car was not the only set of tires that had recently been on that gravel. Aveline noticed it before he did the faint double track running parallel to the main drive branching off toward a service road that led around the back of the property. Someone else has been here, she said. Bennett followed her gaze and his expression sharpened. Gareth's car is not here. He keeps a silver sedan in the main bay. That is not his car, she said. That is a different set of tracks. Fresher. He looked at her, surprised in a way that made her almost smile despite everything. How do you know that? I spend my life reading what people leave behind without meaning to, she said. Spilled coffee tells you who is nervous. A folded napkin tells you who is used to being served. Tire tracks are not so different. They parked well back from the house at her insistence in the shadow of the old oaks that lined the drive and walked the rest of the way on foot. The side entrance into the estate office stood slightly ajar, not forced, not broken, simply not fully closed, the kind of detail a careless person might miss, and a careful one would not. Bennett stopped at the threshold. It was locked when I left, he said quietly. I locked it myself. Then someone has a key, she said, or someone never needed one. They went in slowly. The office smelled of old paper and lemon polish, exactly as Bennett had described it. The two tall filing cabinets along the north wall, the desk that had belonged to his father before Gareth claimed it. The desk drawer stood open. The ledger Bennett had photographed the pages from was gone. He took it, Bennett said. He must have come back for it. Or someone else did, Aveline said. Someone who knew exactly what to look for and exactly where to find it. She moved past him toward the filing cabinets, running her fingers along the edge of the drawer that had held the manila folder with her letters. It was still there exactly where Bennett had left it the day before undisturbed, as though whoever had come for the ledger either had not known about the letters or had not cared. That is strange, she said. What is? If someone came for evidence, why take the financial ledger and leave this? She held up the folder. This is the part that involves a child. This is the part that would matter most to investigators looking at intent. Bennett came to stand beside her, frowning at the folder in her hands. Unless, he said slowly, whoever took the ledger was not trying to protect Gareth. They were trying to protect themselves. Aveline looked up at him. Meaning the ledger has financial entries that implicate someone beyond Gareth. Someone who knew exactly which pages mattered and came to remove only those. He stopped, his eyes moving across the room as though seeing it differently now. Gareth kept everything because he believed in documentation as protection. But documentation only protects you if you control who reads it. If someone else realized what was in that ledger, someone with more to lose than Gareth, they would not care about 2 letters from a waitress. They would care about a paper trail connecting them to 8 years of payments. A car, she said suddenly. What? We should go. Now, if someone was here recently enough to take that ledger before you returned, they may still be close. We are standing in the open with the door ajar in a house no one expected us to be in twice in 2 days. Bennett's expression sharpened with the speed of a man who had spent his career learning to recognize the moment a meeting turned dangerous. They left quickly, locking the side door behind them, out of habit more than confidence, and walked back through the oaks to where the car sat half hidden in shadow. It happened on the coastal road 11 minutes later, on a stretch where the trees pressed close on both sides and the ocean appeared only in brief flashing gaps between them. A dark sedan came up fast behind them, closing the distance with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with simple impatience. And Aveline felt it before she could have named what she felt, that animal awareness she had developed over the years, with a man who used to drive too fast on purpose just to watch her flinch. "Bennett," she said, "that car. I see it. It is too close." The sedan pulled alongside, and for one suspended moment she saw the driver. A man in the sunglasses despite the overcast sky, his face giving nothing away. And then the car drifted hard into their lane, clipping the edge of their bumper, and Bennett's hands fought the wheel as the car shuddered and the guardrail flashed past closer than it should have. "Brake," she said, her voice flat and fast, not loud. "Do not swerve. Brake steady and let him pass." He did exactly that, dropping speed in a controlled line rather than yanking the wheel the way instinct wanted. And the sedan, suddenly without a target ahead of it, shot forward and took the next curve too fast, tires protesting against the asphalt. Bennett pulled onto the shoulder and stopped, both hands locked on the wheel, his breathing audible in the sudden quiet. "How did you know to do that?" he said. "I have spent a lot of years learning what to do when someone wants you to panic," she said. "Panicking is what they are counting on. It buys them room." He looked at her for a long moment, something in his expression rearranging itself entirely. "Call the police," she said. "Now, report the plate if you got any of it." "I got the first 3 letters," he said, already reaching for his phone. While he made the call, she sat very still, watching the empty road ahead, where the sedan had disappeared, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her that whatever this was, it had stopped being abstract. It had stopped being about old letters and locked filing cabinets. Someone had just tried to put them off the road on a public highway, and that meant someone had decided the stakes were worth that particular risk. She thought about Owen at Pauline's house, working on his tide chart, entirely unaware that anything in his life had changed. She thought, this has to end before it reaches him. That evening, back at Pauline's kitchen table with Owen fed and bathed and reading in the guest room, Aveline laid out everything they knew on a single legal pad in her own handwriting, because she had found over the course of the day that writing things down in her own hand helped her see the shape of them more clearly than any photograph on a phone ever could. The letters intercepted, the ledger missing, the car on the coastal road. $2 million over 8 years to an unnamed party. "There is someone above Gareth," she said. "Someone with more at stake than a guardian protecting his own comfortable arrangement." Bennett sat across from her, his tie, long since discarded, sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking more like a man and less like a portfolio than she had yet seen him. "I called Margaret Cole," he said, "my attorney. I told her everything. She is already looking at the trust structure to see who would benefit from keeping me without an acknowledged heir." "What did she find?" "She has not finished, but she said something that stuck with me. She said that an unacknowledged heir does not just affect inheritance down the line, it affects current discretionary authority. If there is no direct heir, certain board members retain broader control over investable assets indefinitely. The moment a child is acknowledged, that control begins to narrow. How much control? She would not say exactly. Not yet, but it is not a small number." Aveline tapped her pen against the legal pad. "So whoever has been paying Gareth has been paying him to keep that control intact. Keeping you isolated was not about protecting your feelings. It was about protecting an arrangement. That is what it looks like." She sat back thinking. In her experience, the people who built arrangements like that did not unbuild them quietly. They protected them with whatever force the situation required, right up until the moment protecting them cost more than the arrangement was worth. "We need to know who is above Gareth before they decide we are worth more trouble than we are," she said. "Otherwise, we are reacting. I do not want to keep reacting." Margaret called the next morning while Aveline was making Owen's breakfast, the phone propped against the coffee maker on speaker, because Bennett had insisted she be part of every call from now on, a small adjustment that had cost him something to make and that she had noticed without commenting on. I have something, Margaret said, her voice clipped, imprecise in the way of someone who had spent 30 years learning not to waste words. The pattern of transfers in the ledger matches a retainer structure, not a series of one-off payments. Fixed intervals, variable amounts within a consistent range. That is what you pay someone for ongoing management, not a single service. Management of what, Evelyn asked. I believe Margaret said carefully management of Bennett, specifically keeping him disengaged from anything that might prompt a restructuring of trust authority. There is a name that keeps surfacing in the trust board minutes whenever discretionary spending comes up. Edmund Voss, senior trustee, 22 years on the board. He has voting authority over a substantial portion of investable assets, and from what I can see in the public filings, several of his private investment vehicles have benefited disproportionately from decisions the board has made over the last decade. Evelyn set down the spatula. Edmund Voss, you know the name, Margaret asked. I have heard Gareth mention him once or twice in passing, when he did not realize I was listening, Evelyn said. I assumed he was just another board member. He may be considerably more than that, Margaret said. I am not ready to say it outright yet, but the shape of this is starting to look less like an estate manager protecting his own small arrangement, and more like an estate manager being paid by someone else to maintain a much larger one. Evelyn glanced toward the doorway where Owen sat at the table working through a bowl of cereal, with the focused seriousness he brought to everything, entirely unaware of the conversation happening 12 feet away. We need proof, she said. Not theory. Proof. I am working on it, Margaret said. But proof of something this size takes time, and time is the one thing I am not certain we have in unlimited supply, given what happened on the coastal road yesterday. That afternoon, the call came. Aveline was at the Foundation office space she had begun quietly scouting above the hardware store on Anchor Street in an idea she had been turning over for months before any of this began, a place to help women in situations like the one she had once been, in women navigating systems that were never built with them in mind. She had told no one about it yet, not even Bennett, because it had felt until recently like a private hope rather than a real plan. Her phone rang with the number she did not recognize. Ms. Sutherland, a man's voice said, smooth, unhurried, the practiced warmth of someone who made calls like this for a living. My name is not important. I am calling on behalf of certain parties with an interest in resolving the current situation efficiently and discreetly. It is the middle of the afternoon, she said, her voice flat. I am working. I understand. I will be brief. The parties I represent are prepared to offer a settlement, substantial, private, structured to ensure the long-term financial security of you and your son without any further complexity. He paused delicately. In exchange for a standard non-disclosure agreement and a formal withdrawal of any paternity-related claims. She stood very still in the empty office space, dust motes turning slowly in the afternoon light through the front window, and she felt something in her chest go cold and very, very clear. How much, she said. A pause on the line, the small recalibration of a man who had expected resistance and instead heard consideration. The initial offer is $2 million structured over 5 years with a standard confidentiality clause and a no, she said. I understand this is a significant decision and you may want time to... No, she said again, and this time her voice did not waver at all. I do not need time. The answer is no. And I would encourage whoever is paying you to make this call to consider contacting their own attorney next, because mine filed papers this morning. There was a silence on the line that had told her more than any answer could have. I see, the man said finally, his warmth gone entirely. I will relay that. She ended the call and stood there a moment longer, her hand not quite steady around the phone, and then she did something she had not planned to do. She opened her recordings app, the one she had quietly turned on the moment she heard an unfamiliar number, a habit she had picked up years earlier and never fully let go of, and she saved the file with a date and a label. Settlement offer, $2 million. Then she called Bennett. They tried to buy me off, she said. $2 million. I said no, and I told them about the filing. What filing? There is no filing yet, she said. But there will be by tonight, because I am not waiting for them to decide what their next move is. I want Margaret to file something today. Anything that puts this on the record before they have time to regroup. There was a brief silence on the line, and then Bennett's voice, careful, almost surprised. You are not asking me what I think we should do. I am telling you what I have already decided, she said. You can tell me if you disagree, But I am not waiting on permission anymore, Bennett. Not from you and not from whoever made that phone call. I do not disagree, he said quietly. I will call Margaret right now. That evening, back at Pauline's kitchen table with Owen safely asleep upstairs, and Margaret on speakerphone working through the language of an emergency motion she intended to file with the federal judge before midnight, Aveline's phone rang again, a different number, this time, no warmth in it at all. Ms. Sutherland, the voice said. Older, controlled. A voice that had spent 50 years learning to make requests sound like observations. I think it is time we spoke directly. Who is this? She said, though some part of her already knew. Edmund Voss, the voice said. I believe you have heard my name once or twice, even if you did not fully understand its weight. Margaret's eyes met Bennett's across the table, both of them going very still. I am listening, Aveline said, keeping her voice level by an act of pure will. You declined a generous offer today, Edmund said. I want you to understand the cost of that decision before it becomes irreversible. This is not simply about money any longer. There are protections in place around what I have built, protections that have held for a very long time, and people who threaten them tend to find that the consequences extend further than they anticipated. Are you threatening my son? She said, and the words came out steadier than she felt, though her hand had gone white-knuckled around the edge of the table. I am explaining the landscape, Edmund said. What happens within that landscape depends entirely on the choices made tonight. The line went dead. Aveline set the phone down very carefully on the kitchen table, as though it might shatter if handled roughly, and for a moment no one in the room said anything at all. He just confirmed it, Margaret said quietly. He confirmed everything on a recorded line if you were recording, which I assume you were. I was, Aveline said. Then we moved tonight, Margaret said, already pulling her laptop closer. Not tomorrow, tonight. I am drafting the emergency motion now, and I need everything, the ledger photographs, the letters, the photograph of Owen as an infant, the recording of the settlement call, the recording of this call, all of it in a single filing that gives a federal judge no room to wait until morning. Bennett looked at Aveline across the table, and something in his expression had shifted entirely from the man who had stood frozen in a lobby 10 days earlier, catching a stranger's son by the shoulders. What do you need from me? He said. I need you to write a personal statement, Aveline said before he could ask her, before anyone else could decide for her what came next. Everything. The boathouse, the storm, the 9 years. What it has cost Owen not to have an answer when he asks who his father is. It has to be specific enough that a judge reading it at midnight understands this is not a business dispute. It is a child's life being used as leverage in someone else's theft. Bennett nodded slowly. And you? I am writing mine too, she said. From the beginning. Every year I waited for a letter that never came. Every year I told myself it did not matter when it mattered every single day. Pauline appeared in the doorway with a fresh pot of coffee no one had asked for, took one look at the room and said nothing at all, only refilled the cups and retreated again, leaving them to the work in front of them. Aveline wrote for nearly 2 hours by hand first, and then typed onto Pauline's old laptop. And she found as she wrote that the hardest part was not remembering the pain of those 9 years, but describing it without flinching, without performing it, and laying it out in language that was simply factual and let the facts carry whatever weight they needed to carry. She wrote about the storm and the boathouse, about the morning she realized she was pregnant, and the careful, hopeful letter she had written that night. She wrote about the second letter 6 months after Owen was born, the photograph clipped to the front, the number she had included in case he wanted to call. She wrote about the 3 months of waiting after that, and the moment she had finally stopped waiting, not out of anger, but out of a kind of necessary self-preservation. She wrote about Owen asking 4 times over the last 2 years what his father was like, and the answer she had given him each time, a good man who simply did not know he existed, a sentence she had chosen to believe even in her angriest moments, because she had not wanted her son to carry resentment towards someone he had never met. She finished and sent it to Margaret at 11:17. Margaret responded 12 minutes later. This is good. This is exactly what we need. Filing now. Bennett finished his own statement shortly after, and the two of them sat at the kitchen table in the low lamplight while Margaret worked the phone with a federal contact she had described only as someone who took matters like this personally, and the house settled into the quiet of people waiting for something they could not control to resolve itself. At 12:43 in the morning, Margaret's text came through. Judge signed. Injunction covers the main trust accounts and 3 associated subsidiaries. Marshals will begin a formal notice in the morning. Aveline read it twice, and something in her chest, some fist she had not fully realized was clenched, loosened slightly for the first time in 10 days. "It is not over," Bennett said quietly, watching her read it. "But the money cannot move." She looked up at him across the table, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "We should sleep," she said finally. "I do not think either of us is going to sleep tonight," he said. She almost smiled at that, the first almost smile in what felt like a very long time. "Probably not," she said, "but we should try." She climbed the stairs to check on Owen one last time before settling onto the narrow couch in Pauline's front room, and she stood in the guest room doorway, watching her son sleep, one arm thrown over his head, exactly the way she always slept. His breathing steady and untroubled, and entirely unaware of the federal injunction now standing between him and the people who had spent 9 years deciding what to do with the inconvenient fact of his existence. She thought about Edmund Voss's voice on the phone, calm and certain even as the ground shifted beneath him. She thought, "You are not done yet, and neither am I." Morning came thin and gray over Harbor Point, the kind of light that arrived without ceremony after a night that had asked too much of everyone. Aveline woke on Pauline's couch with her shoes still on a habit she had developed years ago, and never quite broken the posture of a woman who slept but did not allow herself to rest completely. For a moment she lay still, listening to the house, the quiet of early morning, before anyone else was awake. And then her phone buzzed against the coffee table. "Margaret, 6:14 in the morning. We have a problem." Aveline sat up immediately, the last traces of sleep gone in an instant. She answered on the second ring, keeping her voice low so as not to wake Owen upstairs. "What kind of problem?" "The injunction covered the main trust accounts and the 3 subsidiaries I named in the filing." Margaret said, her voice tight in a way Aveline had not heard from her before, controlled, but clearly strained. "It did not cover a private holding structure that is not listed anywhere under the Ashworth Trust name. Edmund Voss incorporated a separate entity in Delaware 9 years ago. It currently holds approximately $38 million in what appear to be trust assets that were transferred out incrementally over time and never properly reported." She paused. "It has been moving money for the last 2 hours. My contact flagged unusual activity just before dawn." Aveline felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. The vertigo of watching a problem you believe solved reveal itself to be only partially solved. "He is liquidating," she said. "He is trying to," Margaret said. "We have perhaps 4 hours before those assets land somewhere we cannot follow. I can file an emergency motion to extend the injunction, but it means waking a different judge, one who does not yet know any of the background, and making the case compelling enough that he grants it on an emergency basis before 9 in the morning." "Do it," Aveline said. "I need something stronger than what we filed last night," Margaret said. "Last night's filing was about a father being protected from his son. This filing needs to show a man actively destroying evidence of theft in real time. I need specifics. I need to know exactly what Edmund is protecting and why he is protecting it now today with this much urgency." Aveline was already moving toward the kitchen, pulling out the legal pad from the night before, scanning her own handwriting for anything she might have missed. "I want to talk to him," she said. Margaret's voice sharpened. "Talk to who?" "Edmund. Directly. In person." "Absolutely not," Margaret said. "That man called you last night and described consequences extending further than you anticipated. You do not walk into a room with him alone." "I am not asking permission," Aveline said, and she heard her own voice carrying the same flat certainty it had carried on the phone with the man offering $2 million. "He has spent 9 years assuming I was too small to matter. He needs to understand that assumption was wrong, and he needs to understand it from me, not from a filing, not from Bennett, not from you, from me." There was a long silence on the line. "If you do this," Margaret said finally, "you do it with people who can move fast if something goes wrong. I am not letting you walk into that office alone, and neither, I suspect, is Bennett." "I do not need protecting," Aveline said. "I am not talking about protecting you," Margaret said. "I am talking about making sure there are enough witnesses in the room that nothing said today can be quietly denied tomorrow." Bennett came downstairs 20 minutes later, already dressed, his face carrying the exhaustion of a man who had not slept and did not appear to have expected to. He found Aveline at the kitchen table with the legal pad open in front of her, writing quickly, and he stood in the doorway a moment before speaking. "Margaret called me," he said. "You want to go see Edmund yourself?" "I do. That is not a small risk." "I know what the risk is," she said, looking up at him. "I have known what the risk is since the moment Gareth stood beside my car and told me to be thoughtful for the boy's sake. I am done letting other people decide how thoughtful I am going to be." Bennett studied her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted. Not resistance, something closer to the recognition he had shown her in the estate office 2 days earlier. "Then I am coming with you," he said. "Not instead of you. With you." She nodded once. That she could accept. They left Owen with Pauline and Russ, who had arrived early that morning at Pauline's invitation, a quiet, solid presence in the kitchen, with a thermos of his own coffee and an easy manner with children that put Owen at ease almost immediately. Pauline walked them to the door, her expression serious in a way it had not been the night before. "Be careful," she said. "Not because I doubt you, because careful and brave are not opposites. The smart ones manage to be both." Edmund Voss kept an office on the top floor of a glass building overlooking the harbor in the city 40 minutes inland from Harbor Point, a space designed to communicate the same permanence. The Ashworth estate itself communicated, except newer, sharper, built on money that had not had a century to soften its edges. Aveline and Bennett rode the elevator up together in silence, Margaret having arranged to meet them in the lobby with a folder of documents and an expression that made clear she was not entirely comfortable with the plan, but had stopped trying to talk anyone out of it. The receptionist on the top floor did not want to let them through without an appointment, and it was Aveline who stepped forward, not Bennett, who said with a calm that surprised even her that Mr. Voss would want to make time for this particular conversation, and that the alternative was a federal courtroom, which she imagined he would prefer to avoid for as long as possible. Something in her tone, or perhaps simply the unexpected confidence of a woman the receptionist had clearly not expected to carry herself that way, prompted a phone call, a pause, and then a door opening down the hall. Edmund Voss's office was exactly what Aveline had imagined from his voice on the phone. Dark wood low lighting, a view of the harbor that made the water look like something owned rather than simply observed. He stood when they entered, 68 years old, silver-haired, the composed stillness of decades of never once being surprised by a room he walked into. Gareth Pruitt sat in a chair near the window, and the moment Aveline saw his face, she understood that whatever calm Edmund possessed, Gareth had run out of entirely. His hands were folded in his lap, but they were not still. His eyes moved between Edmund and the door, with the restlessness of a man calculating exits. "Miss Sutherland," Edmund said, and his voice was exactly as smooth in person as it had been on the phone. Perhaps smoother, the warmth fully restored now that he was on familiar ground. "I confess I did not expect you to come yourself. I find that conversations go better when people have to look at who they are actually talking to," she said. Edmund's eyes moved to Bennett, then to Margaret, taking in the small assembled audience with the careful attention of a man recalculating odds in real time. "Please sit," he said. "We will stand," Aveline said. A flicker crossed his face, brief, almost amused, the expression of a man unaccustomed to having the rhythm of a meeting taken from him. He remained standing as well, hands clasped loosely behind his back. "I understand there was an unfortunate phone call last night," he said. "I want to be clear that any suggestion of threat was poorly communicated, and I regret the impression it left." "It was not poorly communicated," Aveline said. "It was very clearly communicated. You told me the consequences would extend further than I anticipated. I would like you to explain right now exactly what those consequences were going to be." Edmund's composure did not crack, but something behind his eyes recalibrated the look of a man revising his estimate of the person in front of him. "I think you are overstating the tone of that conversation," he said. "I recorded it," Aveline said. The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds, and in that silence she watched Gareth's hands tighten in his lap. "That is," Edmund said slowly, "an interesting thing to admit to a man's face. It is an even more interesting thing to play for a federal judge," Aveline said. "Which is precisely what is happening this morning, alongside an emergency motion to freeze a Delaware entity that has been moving $38 million out of accounts it should never have held in the first place." For the first time since they had entered the room, something genuine moved across Edmund's face. Not panic, not yet, but the first true crack in a composure that had clearly held for decades. "You do not understand the structures you are describing," he said, his voice losing some of its smoothness. I understand exactly what a retainer payment looks like, Aveline said. I understand what it means when a man is paid the same irregular amount every 8 to 14 months for 8 years to keep a person isolated from information that belonged to him. I understand what it means when 2 letters from a mother are filed under a reference number and marked held for future disposition as though my son were paperwork. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. I understand all of it, Mr. Voss, because I have spent 6 years of my life reading exactly the kind of careful, deliberate carelessness that men like you depend on, no one noticing. Gareth shifted in his chair, and Edmund's eyes cut toward him briefly. A warning, though whether it was a warning to stay silent or a warning that silence would no longer be enough, Aveline could not tell. Gareth Bennett said, speaking for the first time since they had entered the room, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a man who had once trusted this person completely. You have known me since I was 19 years old. You sat at my father's funeral. You held my hand at the hospital when he had his stroke. He paused. I am asking you not as an attorney, not as part of a filing, as the boy you raised half of to tell me the truth right now in this room. Before this goes any further than it already has. Something moved in Gareth's face, and for a moment, Aveline thought she saw the man underneath the rehearsed composure, old and frightened, and finally out of room to maneuver. Gareth Edmund said sharply, "Do not." "I have been recording you," Gareth said. The room went completely still. Edmund turned to look at him fully, and whatever warmth had remained in his expression evaporated entirely. "What did you say?" "I have been recording you," Gareth said again, his voice gaining a brittle steadiness, the voice of a man who has finally decided which version of his own destruction he prefers. "For 4 months. Since the second time you suggested that if anyone outside the board ever learned the full scope of the Delaware structure, I would be the one positioned to take the blame for all of it, while you walked away as a man who had simply trusted his estate manager too much." Edmund's face had gone very pale. "You recorded our conversations," he said, as though testing the words for truth by speaking them aloud. "I did it to protect myself," Gareth said. "I always knew you would let me be the one who fell if it ever came to that. I have audio of you describing the original structure of the payments. I have audio of you instructing me on what to do if correspondence ever arrived from Miss Sutherland. I have audio of you discussing how an acknowledged heir would affect board discretionary authority and how that authority needed to be protected at any cost." Margaret had already stepped forward, her phone out recording openly, now no longer hiding it. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, her voice careful, almost gentle in a way that surprised Aveline, "are you willing to provide that audio to federal investigators?" Gareth looked at Edmund for a long moment, the two of them locked in some private reckoning that had clearly been building for far longer than the 4 months he had mentioned. And then he looked away toward the window, toward the harbor beyond it. "Yes," he said quietly, "I am." Edmund's hands, which had remained clasped behind his back the entire conversation, came forward now, and for the first time Aveline saw them tremble slightly. "This is absurd," he said, his voice climbing for the first time. "You are taking the word of a disgraced estate manager and he stopped himself, but not quite quickly enough. "A waitress," Aveline said evenly. "You can say it. I have been called worse by people with far less to lose than you currently have." Edmund's jaw tightened, and for a moment the room held its breath, the silence that exists just before something irreversible happens. "My phone," Aveline said, "is downstairs in Margaret's bag, already syncing the recording from last night to a secure server. Your assets in Delaware are about to be frozen by a federal judge who is reading my personal statement about 9 years without an answer from my son, alongside Gareth's recordings of you describing how to make sure I never got one." She held his gaze. "You do not have a version of today that ends with this quiet." Edmund stood very still, and something in his posture finally visibly broke the stillness of decades giving way all at once to something smaller and more exposed underneath it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced down. Pauline. She answered immediately, something in the timing of it, pulling her stomach tight before Pauline even spoke. "There is a car," Pauline said, her voice low and controlled, the careful calm of someone trying not to alarm a child in the next room. "It has been parked across the street for almost 20 minutes. Not moving, engine off. A man got out a few minutes ago and is walking the perimeter of the yard." Aveline's blood went cold. "Owen," she said, "he is with Russ in the kitchen. He is fine. But Aveline, I do not like this." Call the police, she said, already moving toward the door, Bennett immediately at her side, having heard enough of the conversation to understand. Tell them exactly what you told me. We are 40 minutes away. Lock every door. Do not let Owen near a window. She ended the call and looked at Edmund, who stood frozen by his own window, the harbor view behind him suddenly looking less like ownership and more like exposure. If anything happens to my son, she said, her voice low and absolutely level, there will not be a courtroom large enough to hold what I do next. I do not control what happens outside this room, Edmund said. And for the first time, he sounded less like a man in command and more like a man watching his own carefully built world come apart faster than he could manage it. Then you had better hope, Margaret said already on her phone calling the federal contact, that whoever is at that house turns around before anyone has to find out whether that is true. They drove back to Harbor Point faster than the speed limit allowed. Bennett's hands tight on the wheel, Aveline's phone in her hand the entire time, refreshing nothing because there was nothing yet to refresh, only the silence of waiting for Pauline to call back. The call came 18 minutes later. It is over, Pauline said immediately before Aveline could even finish answering. Everyone is fine. Owen does not even know anything happened. Aveline closed her eyes, the relief hitting her so hard she had to put a hand against the dashboard to steady herself. What happened, she said. Russ saw him first, Pauline said. The man at the back door trying the handle. Russ has been a groundskeeper for 30 years, Aveline. He notices people who do not belong somewhere faster than anyone I have ever met. He went out the front, came around quiet, and by the time the man realized he was not alone, the police were already 2 minutes out. There was a brief moment. Russ is fine, just a bruised hand from where he grabbed the man's arm. But the police arrived and took him into custody before anything worse happened. Did he say anything, Aveline asked. He said almost nothing, Pauline said. But the officers found something in his jacket. A photograph of your car. Notes on Owen's school schedule. Aveline felt the floor tilt again, a different kind of vertigo, this time the specific horror of confirmation. This was not a random break-in, Pauline said quietly. Someone sent him. By the time they reached Pauline's house, 2 patrol cars sat in the driveway, and a detective stood on the porch taking notes while Russ sat at the kitchen table holding an ice pack against his knuckles, looking entirely unbothered by the entire experience. The way men who had spent their lives doing physical work tended to look at minor injuries. Owen sat beside him, fully absorbed in showing him a diagram of tidal patterns, blessedly, completely unaware that anything had happened beyond an unfamiliar man walking through the yard. Aveline crossed the kitchen and knelt beside her son, pulling him into a brief, fierce hug that he tolerated with the patient confusion of an 8-year-old who did not understand the sudden affection but was not opposed to it. You okay, Mom? He asked, pulling back to look at her face with that uncanny directness she had come to expect from him. I am now, she said. The detective, a woman named Officer Reyes with a careful, methodical manner, took Aveline's statement on the porch while Bennett called Margaret to relay everything. And within the hour, the full shape of the morning had assembled itself into something that would matter enormously in a federal courtroom. The man arrested at Pauline's house had a phone with 3 calls to a number that once subpoenaed traced back to a burner registered through one of Edmund Voss's shell entities in Delaware. It was not Gareth who sent him, Margaret said over the phone that afternoon, her voice tight with something that sounded almost like grim satisfaction. The timeline does not work. This was arranged before this morning's meeting, which means Edmund had already decided to escalate before you ever walked into his office. Which means the recordings, the freeze, none of it changed his plan. He had already moved past threats to action. That should terrify me more than it does, Aveline said, sitting on Pauline's porch steps with the late afternoon light slanting gold across the yard. It terrifies all of us, Margaret said. But it also helps us. A man who sends someone to surveil a child's school schedule on the same morning federal investigators are reviewing recordings of him discussing how to suppress a paternity claim is not a man any judge is going to extend patience to. I expect an arrest warrant before tonight. The arrest warrant came at 9:40 that evening. Margaret called with the news, her voice carrying an exhaustion that had finally let itself show the sound of someone who had been running on adrenaline for 36 hours and was only now allowing herself to feel it. Edmund Voss was taken into custody at his home at 8:15, she said. Federal agents' full search warrant on the office and the residence. The Delaware accounts were frozen 40 minutes before the transfer would have completed. He came within minutes of moving the assets somewhere we could not have followed. And Gareth Aveline asked, Cooperating fully, Margaret said. He has handed over 4 months of recordings, copies of every ledger entry, and a written statement implicating Edmund in the original decision to intercept your letters. His attorney is already negotiating a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation. He will face consequences, but considerably lighter ones than Edmund. Aveline sat with the phone against her ear, looking out across Pauline's dark yard where the police cars had long since left and the ordinary quiet of the street had reasserted itself, and she felt something in her chest finally slowly begin to unclench after 10 days of holding itself braced. "It is not over," Margaret said gently, as though reading the shape of her silence. "There will be depositions and hearings, probably a trial eventually, though. I suspect Edmund's attorneys will push hard for a plea once they see the full weight of what we have. But the immediate danger, the part that could have reached Owen, that is over tonight." "Thank you," Aveline said. "You did the hardest part yourself," Margaret said. "I just filed the paperwork." Bennett found her on the porch steps after the call ended, and he sat down beside her without speaking. The two of them looking out at the dark yard together, the first real stillness either of them had experienced in what felt like a very long time. "You went into that office today like you had been doing it your whole life," he said finally. "I have been managing difficult people my whole life," she said. "I just never had this much riding on it before." He was quiet a moment. "I wanted to walk in first," he said. "I almost insisted on it in the car before we got there, and then I watched you talk to him, and I realized I would have done it wrong. I would have made it about leverage and money and board structures. You made it about what was actually true, that he had decided my son was a liability to be managed. That was always the truest version of it," she said. "Everything else was just the shape they put around it to make it easier to live with." He looked at her in the porch light, and something in his expression carried none of the careful neutrality she had first seen across a hotel lobby 10 days earlier. "I do not know what I would have done if that man at the house had reached Owen," he said quietly. "He did not," she said, "because Russ noticed and Pauline called the police, and Owen is inside right now explaining tide charts to a man who has spent 30 years patient enough to listen to exactly that kind of thing." She paused. "We did this. Not just me. All of us." Owen turned 9 the following October, and they celebrated on Pauline's porch with a cake. Aveline had made herself slightly lopsided, fiercely decorated with more sprinkles than the recipe had called for because Owen had insisted on helping. Pauline was there, and Russ, who had become something between a neighbor and a fixed point in all their lives, and Bennett, who had spent the better part of the past 11 months learning what it meant to belong somewhere without presuming too much too quickly. The federal case against Edmund Voss had taken those 11 months to move from indictment toward an eventual plea agreement, the full scope of what he had built slowly becoming visible. The way things become visible when they are finally placed in the light, larger than anyone had initially understood. $38 million in diverted assets. 14 shell entities across 3 states. Gareth Pruitt paid $640,000 across 8 years to manage, as Edmund's own attorneys eventually characterized it in filings that clearly hoped to minimize what they were describing the information flow within the Ashworth family's personal affairs. 2 letters, 1 photograph of an 8-month-old child filed under a reference number and marked held for future disposition. That phrase had appeared in the federal indictment, and it had appeared in newspaper coverage, and it had appeared eventually in testimony before a state committee reviewing trust law protections for unacknowledged beneficiaries, testimony that Aveline herself had been asked to give and had given calm and precise and devastating in its specificity, exactly the way she had once given her deposition. She had attended every day of Garrett's much shorter sentencing hearing, not out of anger, but because she had decided somewhere in those 11 months that the particular category of harm Edmund and Gareth had committed, the managed disappearance of a child from his father's life, the reduction of a son to a reference number in a ledger, deserved to be witnessed by someone with standing to witness it. She had not attended Edmund's hearings as consistently. She had come to understand about herself a woman who organized her life around the punishment of people who had wronged her. She was a woman who organized her life around what came next. The Coastal Foundation had opened its doors that spring in the small office space above the hardware store on Anchor Street that she had first scouted out months before any of this began, back when it had felt like a private hope rather than a real plan. She had funded the initial build-out with money Bennett had offered, though she had negotiated the figure down twice before accepting it, because she had needed the foundation to be something she had built rather than something simply given to her. He had let her negotiate, understanding eventually that the arguing was the point. The foundation served single parents navigating economic crisis across the small coastal towns that bracketed Harbor Point, the ones without resort economies and without the visibility that came with them. Legal aid, emergency housing assistance, a small but growing network of volunteer advisors who had themselves once navigated exactly the kind of institutional indifference Aveline had learned across 9 years how to route around. She ran it from that small office with 2 staff members and a rotating roster of volunteers in the operational efficiency of a woman who had once run a luxury resort floor on insufficient sleep and inadequate staffing and had developed in that crucible an almost alarming capacity for solving practical problems quickly. Bennett came by sometimes in the late afternoon with coffee, though not every day. He had understood fairly quickly that coming every day would mean something he had not yet been invited to mean, and that meaning something you had not been invited to mean was exactly the kind of presumption she had spent years learning to be careful around. So he came when she texted, and he texted when something seemed worth texting about, and on the weekends, Owen had largely designed for himself, with a specificity that continued to startle both of them. He brought Owen to the office sometimes, where the boy sat in the corner doing homework, and occasionally asked the foundation's legal intake volunteer pointed practical questions that had begun to endear him to people who had not previously had much reason to think about what kind of person a 9-year-old could become. She ran into Gareth Pruitt once after his sentencing by accident, the kind of accidental geography small coastal towns specialized in. He had been released on probation, his cooperation having reduced his sentence considerably, and they crossed paths outside the post office on Harbor Point's main street on an ordinary Saturday morning. He looked older than the months alone should have accounted for the look of a man whose internal architecture had shifted, the way buildings sometimes looked after earthquakes, technically intact, but visibly altered in the foundation. He opened his mouth as though to say something. Aveline simply looked at him, not with anger, not anymore, but with the stillness of someone who had nothing left to ask him and nothing left to forgive him for, because forgiveness had never been the point. He closed his mouth, nodded once, and walked on, and she stood on the sidewalk a moment, in the ordinary Saturday morning, a woman with a stroller passing a dog barking somewhere, the sound of the harbor beyond the buildings, and she felt nothing in particular, which was not what she had expected. She had expected satisfaction, or the slow burn of anger finally finding its target. What she felt instead was simply the absence of all of it, a clean emptiness, as though a space that had been occupied by a heavy weight had finally quietly been cleared. They had dinner that evening, the three of them, Aveline, Bennett, and Owen, who had lobbied successfully to come this time, at a small place on the water that had been there since before the resort expansion and had not updated its menu or its lighting in 20 years, the kind of place where the food tasted like someone had made it rather than performed it. Owen ordered the same thing he always ordered and spent most of the meal explaining to Bennett in considerable technical detail why a particular paper airplane design he had been refining for weeks kept stalling at the apex of its flight, and Bennett listened with the same intent attention Aveline had first noticed in him on a garden bench 10 months and what felt like an entire lifetime earlier. After dinner, while Owen ran ahead along the public beach south of the resort, the stretch that had always belonged to the people of Harbor Point, and that the development money had never quite managed to absorb Aveline, and Bennett walked along the waterline with the comfortable silence that had grown between them over the months, the silence of two people who had stopped performing ease and had found something that actually was. "He wants a dog," Bennett said. "I know," Aveline said. "He has been telling everyone. He told Pauline, he told Russ, he told the new intake volunteer at the foundation who he met for approximately 12 minutes. He is building a coalition. He is going to win," Aveline said, and she said it with a mixture of resignation and warmth that characterized how she talked about her son in the moments when she was not aware of being observed. "I have known he was going to win since October. I am just making him work for it because the process is good for him." Ahead of them, Owen crouched at the waterline examining something the tide had left behind, his red jacket vivid against the darkening sand, and Bennett watched him with an expression Aveline had come to recognize, the stillness of a man who still, after all these months, had not entirely gotten used to the fact that this extraordinary person was his son. "I think about the lobby sometimes," he said quietly. "The 30 seconds I stood there not moving after he ran into me. I did not have language for what had just happened. I just knew something had changed and I could not undo it. I remember she said, I thought you were just another guest who did not know how to handle a child's apology. I was terrified, he said. I just did not have a face for terrified yet. I had to learn that one. She looked at him in the cooling evening light, the lines of his face she had come to know well over the past 11 months. And she thought about everything that had happened since that 30-second collision in a hotel lobby. The letters, the ledger, the car on the coastal road, the man at Pauline's back door, the office on the top floor of a glass building where she had finally said out loud everything she had been carrying for 9 years. Thank you, Bennett said. For what? For the letters, he said. For writing them when you did not have to. For choosing to believe I was a good man even when the evidence said otherwise. He paused. For letting me be here. Aveline held his gaze for a moment, and something in her settled not entirely. Not all at once, the way ice does not melt all at once, but makes its decisions slowly in increments until one day it simply is not there anymore. You are not all the way here yet, she said. I know. But you are getting there, she said, and it was not a declaration. It was the thing that came before a declaration, the tentative weight shift of two people standing at the edge of something that did not yet need a name. Owen turned and shouted something at them, the wind taking the words and leaving only the tone gleeful and demanding, waving them forward toward whatever he had found at the waterline. Aveline started walking first. Bennett fell into step beside her, their shoulders close without quite touching, and ahead of them their son was already turning back to the water, already looking for the next thing, the next shell, the next problem that required his full attention. The tide was going out behind them, pulling at the sand with the sound it had always made indifferent and steady, erasing their footprints one by one as they walked the marks. They had made smoothing back into nothing, until the only direction that held their shape at all was forward into the gathering dark, into the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being here together known, and finally after everything no longer waiting.